Come, Holy Spirit, calm us and inspire us, and whisper to our hearts the word you've prepared for us in the meditation of this evening. We have the grace also to apply it to our lives on a daily basis. In the letter to the church of Tyre, again in chapter 2 of the Apocalypse, we have these words. The angel of the church in Thyatira write, "The words of the Son of God, who has eyes like a flame of fire, and whose feet are like burnished bronze. I know your works, your love and faith and service and patient endurance, and that your latter works exceed the first." But then the Lord goes on to point out that there is contamination in their doctrine. "I have this against you, that you tolerate the woman Jezebel, who calls herself prophetess, and is teaching and beguiling my servants to practice immorality." And on it goes. Well, there is contamination in the air, and we have to fight in the Lord's name on behalf of the truth. The truth is one. Sometimes one has to be economical in how much of what one knows one expresses according to the context and the situation, but to compromise with what we know to be the truth is to play the game of its enemy. And we are the Lord's mouthpiece for defending the truth. Some years ago in Italy, I was in a convent of Benedictine nuns, and one of them passed on to me something that another had been given from somebody who was an expert in researching material on what was out there. And it was a series of documents from the realm of exorcism. And what was coming through was that at the present time, the greatest friends, in inverted commas, of the satanic forces were priests, because those in question, were the ones who had influence, and by submitting awares or unawares to his inspirations and nudges, were favouring enormously his work of confusion. And when one observes certain priests having a great success, in inverted commas, and favoured even by the media in some cultures, one sometimes asks, are they being favoured also by sinister forces? Whereas priests who are fairly keen on defending the truth as they know it and have studied it and want to be honouring the Lord as Logos in the conservation of that integrity of corpus received, are very often unexpectedly attacked, and by their own. It can happen sometimes as a pattern emerging. I have heard it on the grapevine that it is something actually that might be found in a seminary situation, where, for instance, particularly conservative, faithful and orthodox students are not favoured, and indeed, eventually, for some usually petty reason, somehow encouraged to move on, whereas others are allowed to proceed to ordination. And likewise, even amongst those promoted to ordination, that some who are according to the mindset of those who might be in positions of authority in the seminary situation, following the type and mode of priest that they want, are not promoted to higher studies after ordination, whereas those who are more competent academically, but particularly orthodox and traditional, are not. And so over the life of an area, or even a country, a pattern emerges that certain priests are favoured and given influence by the positions they acquire, and others are not. And so, over a period, the pattern that emerges is a certain type of church that is wanted by certain powerful people. Now, what I'm saying is kind of in-house stuff. But if you look around, there's some truth in it, it would seem, or there has been over a certain period, which explains how, right now, in the half-century of time after the Second Vatican Council, we have a situation which is not quite so simple. It's had a situation there where, in practice, different from the East, things have been allowed to come in initially as exceptions and indults, which then became very quickly norms, and against which one had no liberty anymore to react. We had an interesting case recently in England with the publication of the new missal. I don't know where you're at in Holland, but we have a very good missal now in traditional English. We have recuperated the richness of the Latin, and it's a very good publication. But when it came to its publication in England, specifically, not in Ireland, but in England, in the introductory part of it was, amongst other things, put this instruction from the Episcopal Conference of England and Wales, that in this country the norm for the reception of Holy Communion is standing, and I can't remember whether, I don't think actually the question of the tongue came into it, but the standing did definitely, and that was interesting because it was picked up by those who saw what the implications were as a typical reflection of the way in which legitimate liberty has been actually reduced. And actually it's gone further insofar as when, in practice, as I hear on the grapevine, in some places that people opt to receive kneeling and also on their tongue, quite often they are badly treated, bullied. And Cardinal Rinse, who used to be head of the congregation for the Divine Worship and Divine Discipline of Sacraments, had this phrase with regard to that kind of abusive behaviour, that people should come from Holy Communion in peace and not in pieces. And indeed, there was a rescript from that same congregation for Divine Worship and the Discipline of Sacraments regarding this question of refusal on the part of some to give Holy Communion to those who want it on the tongue. It was a rescript, very recent. Well, it actually was, I think, 2009. And I have it actually. It's very calmly worded, but it's indicating the rights of the communicant and the total absence of authority to deny Holy Communion to a person on that motive, and also indicated that the specific case in question was being handled, meaning that they were writing to the bishop of whoever it was in question to make sure that was sorted out. And the implication was, and it was coming already from the Vatican, that any behaviour of that nature was to be reported. And if it wasn't handled locally, it was to be reported to the Vatican. And they would deal with it. Because that's what's been going on massively. Individual priests have been creating their own model of parish without basically the blessing of higher authority. And it became very difficult after a while for that to be readjusted. If a bishop did step in and he was drawing in a wasp's nest into his hair, it was a very difficult situation to handle when generality became then a norm and a law. However, we must remember that we are not of today, that we have 2,000 years behind us, and the only safe interpretation of an ecumenical council is precisely the living church in its entirety. There is a presumption in the mode of thinking of a person who discards 2 millennia so as to justify a norm which is extremely recent and actually extremely local on the level of the East and the West put together. The very concept of liturgy has actually evolved dramatically in 50 years, under the influence actually of what has come out of the Church. I mean the Protestant Reformation, because there has been by osmosis a certain communication of modes without the benefit quite often of the best of Protestantism, who actually do pray well. Protestants are good at what they're at, and we ape them badly, using our own. Bishop Athanasius Schneider analyzes various elements of correct and incorrect interpretation of the grace of the Second Vatican Council, and towards the end of one magisterial article which he published in 2010, he indicates the importance of one particular element. It's that precisely of those who bear responsibility. We are in that position insofar as we are free to obey or disobey, to inform or disinform, to educate or to disedify, to honour God or ourselves. But there is more responsibility again from those who have authority over others, for instance in the formation of other priests, and or again in that of bishops, and indeed a lot in the case of those who are responsible for electing bishops. And as we know, we are also part of that process. Every time there is a local, or whatever it might be, demission of bishop, we're all consulted, and so we're part of the process. But this question goes back as far as earlier councils, notably the Council of Trent, who had a similar problem in having to purify a situation there, and therefore instituting the whole system of seminaries that we have now, which wasn't there before. It was different the way in which future priests were formed. But that council already had insisted on this question. Thus, to all who for any reason have received from the Holy See any right to intervene in the promotion of future prelates, and to those who take part in other ways, the Holy Council exhorts them and admonishes them to recall foremost that they can do nothing more useful to the glory of God and to the salvation of peoples than to dedicate themselves to choose good and suitable pastors to govern the church. Now, we had this morning in the Gospel the place of the Pharisees occupying the seat of Moses, and that was upheld by the Lord. Then he went on to indicate the difference between word and practice. But this question of laying burdens on people and not lifting a finger to ease them can come through to us. I touched on it earlier today, but I want to touch on it again. the question of our attitude, both to God and to man. If one looks carefully at the evolution of a person who is getting higher in grades, acquiring influence and name, it applies in the secular field, it applies in the popular field, for instance, of pop culture and acting, stardom. It applies also in the specific field in which we operate. Well, things sometimes have a pattern there. The psychology of a person who acquires fame can be looked at in its evolution. There are interesting cases that one can study, the Beatles and so on, at a very early age, and the evolution in thought of John Lennon in particular, in the way that he openly, towards the end of his life, was able to talk about what he believed in and didn't believe in, with a certain self-confidence which was actually quite frightening. And similar patterns have emerged in recent times on television, that God can be freely mocked. Well, something not dissimilar can happen also even in the sacred sphere of our career. If one looks at some who have fairly swift promotion, not all, there are brilliant exceptions, but one thing can often emerge: their attitude to people changes. And it's quite frightening sometimes in the way in which it can change. There is one thing which can come through. It's what we call in English aloofness. It's when one stands off, one is not accessible, one is given the impression by approaching a person that one is not worthy of his attention, and it's hard to get. He's not available. Letters are not answered, and so on. I have heard many complaints about letters not being answered by people in authority. It's the worst possible insult to the dignity of a Christian for whom one is there to save. There is no category A and category B. We're not on top of them. We're to help them to get to salvation. And that attitude must be found. Servus servorum Dei was coined by Gregory the Great, and is still there. There are brilliant exceptions. It just happens that our own bishop, unfortunately, has got to retire, but our own bishop in Meath is a brilliant exception. And since he's been a bishop, he's ordained well over 100 priests. And it's usually our diocese which has most Christians in the seminary. And he also accepts easily priests from elsewhere who are in trouble, or seminarians. He also takes very good care of each one who might be in difficulty. Saying difficulty in the seminary, he'll send them to Rome or whatever. And he has time. Every letter that one writes to him will receive an answer the following day. And every time that one phones, even the secretary of the bishop, it's the bishop that one gets usually, he answers the phone himself. And he always ends with a blessing or something on the phone. He cares. He cares. He comes to me every month. He doesn't have to, but he cares. Physically now. Now, this is servus servorum Dei, a person who sacrifices himself without in any way giving the impression that one is not worth his attention. If a bishop can do that, what ought we not to do? They pick it up straight away. The distant priest, or the priest who loves and cares, who loves them into being. One day, a tramp was lying in the gutter in the Vatican area. He caught the attention of John Paul II, who was on a stroll. The saintly pontiff asked him what he was up to and where he'd come from. It turned out that he was a priest. He'd left the priesthood years previously and got himself into an awful mess. Just like that, St. John Paul II asked him humbly, "Would you please hear my confession?" Of course, he had all the faculties. It was an immediate return to grace and to the practice of the priesthood. He saw the immortal Jew that he had before him, didn't judge him one little bit, but loved him back into being. Every person who comes to us might be in a similar situation. I want to make one comparison with regard to the fruits of this endemic stardom and brilliance in what has led to self-seeking indirectly in the service of God. I mean by being a brilliant, innovative, inventive clergyman, therefore useful as a future bishop and so on. The pattern that it has had in creating very efficacious, active clergy and therefore priests at a high level, compared with the other model that we must not ignore, especially in this time of dialogue with our brethren in the East. We know that the present Holy Father is fairly keen on perpetuating the work of John Paul II and Benedict with regard to getting the Church to breathe again with its two lungs. Well, this comes into the equation because we need to have the mind of history, the mind of Christ, with regard to the totality of his vision and desire. It was not his desire that there should be a split of four patriarchates from the Patriarch of the West and the one that had to be there for the completeness of the Church. The Pope Peter had to be there. Remember, there had been a move earlier, in the earlier centuries, to move the weight of centrality to Constantinople because of its link with the powerful empire still there until 1453. But fairly early on, the Spirit moved the important people in authority to stop it because Peter had to be there and had to be at the center. So they can't have a real ecumenical council in the East. You can only have a pan-Orthodox synod. And they're bound to feel the absence of Peter. But we too must feel the absence of the East. Now, I'm making a point here which is a bit osé, but it has to be made, because it might counterbalance the thing by shifting it to a wider spectrum. We are used to thinking within our Western vision of the totality there within what actually would have been historically the Western Patriarchate. It's a problem because we haven't got that break of the Eastern bulldozer. We haven't got the weight of unchanging tradition to calm us down. Now, there's one specific area where that is felt. They do not call themselves Orthodox without reason. For them, this straight, upright opinion, doxe and glory, is the measure. And therefore, and this is the point, they are nervous now more than before when dialoguing with the West, which has been influenced by what has come out of the West. They know that we're in trouble, and therefore they don't want to take on more trouble. So it's not so simple. If one goes to Mount Athos, one sees there what certain things mean to the East. And they have a weight of sanctity which we cannot belittle or ignore. And it's presumptuous to do so. In which grace is hugely operative and also divine favor. They have miracles. Now, what I want to make is this point. It's a specific one. If things have been able to happen with relatively little opposition within 50 years, as a result of a weight of a certain type of priest having this element of influence through a career which was successful, and not able to happen in the same period in the East, it is linked with one specific problem. It's because in the West, the criteria of election of those who are going to be carrying the weight of authority and tradition into the next generation are quite different from those which are preponderant in the East. In the West, if one looks carefully at the criteria, they go something in this line. Is the priest of good standing, of course? Is the priest of intellectual caliber? It's important. In fact, I was talking to a person who works in the Vatican one day, and he was saying that yes, they still have to have more than a doctorate, but at least a license. But anyway, is he pastorally aware, experienced, efficacious, and that kind of thing? And certain others which are looked at very carefully, consulting local priests and so on. Jump to the East, what do you find? A totally different ballgame. First, in the East, he cannot be coming from a parish normally. Why? Because all the parish priests are from the married clergy normally. Therefore, the criteria are radically different. Where are they coming from? Nearly to a man, they're coming from the monastic life. What is the monastic life in the East? It's unhurried, unchanged, uncontaminated, and purely vertical. So what have you got? A body of men listening, not to man, but to God. Contemplatives. People over whom the Holy Spirit has influence and sway, and therefore influence and sway over a huge body of others listening to the same voice. Do you see the difference that's going to make over the level of a huge church? Now, to clean that mess up is not so simple when it comes to dialogue with people who are rightly nervous about what we've constructed in the West since the split in 1054. And so our attitude must be that of, first of all, respect, and not something similar to those who are in our own camp, for instance, those of the extreme right, who come at the Vatican right now, telling the Vatican how wrong they are. You know who I mean. We have the same problem in reverse. We come to our brethren who are perhaps on the spiritual level higher than we are, with fear and trembling, wanting to know what the Spirit is saying to all the churches. I just want to conclude on one point. It has been picked up that we are in an age where there's something moving. The Lord has been putting on the heart of people who count and have influence the desire to heal this rift, which has been going on for a millennium too long. And it's coming through different sources. In the 80s already, there was the case, she's alive, she'd have our age, and she was a young married lady, married already at the age of 17. Her name was Mirna. And she was just an ordinary, she would be of Oriental rite, but under the Vatican, and that's important. And therefore the Vatican was involved when it came to examining it. Now what was happening was this. Initially it was pretty calm, but the area in which was happening was not without significance. It was Damascus, one of the most ancient cities with continuous history in the world. And it was happening in the very house, or just over 100 opposite over, where St. Paul had been given his sight back and also his baptism, the house of Ananias. Now, she was there with her Eastern style prayer, and she had an icon, and the icon began to do things. And then other people brought their icons, and these began to do things as well, oil coming out of the icons and doing miracles. And then more things started to happen. She started to get gifts, including the stigmata, but one thing was coming through every year. It was that through her, the Lord was making known, and also wanting the Vatican to listen, to the fact that it was his desire that this business of 2 Easters should stop. And to prove it, he was making a point physically with miracles. Every 5 years, when the 2 Easters coincided, huge things would happen in conjunction with her miracles and so on, and these icons doing. It was quite clear, and the Vatican was listening carefully, and they were trying to find out what exactly was going on. And I believe that when John Paul II went to the Holy Land, I think they met. And the burden of the communications going on was this, that the Lord was not pleased with our entrenchment, our self-sufficiency in our comfort zone of separation. This had not been his doing, he wanted it healed. Now, there are others also around the world who have been, it would seem, getting the same message. Now, we don't know the case of how authentic Vasula is, Vasula Biden, but she, say what you like, she has been actively getting the same thing for a long time, exactly wanting to heal this. But remember that she's Greek Orthodox, but very close to Rome and being given this Roman language with Sacred Heart and so on, out of the blue. Anyway, to cut a long story short, Benedict XVI, before he abdicated, did draw up a carefully calculated document which was proposing essentially a model where it could work, and he, being one of the brains of our century, could see all the intricacies involved and knew exactly what he was saying and doing and writing. Of course, he's abdicated now, but the fact that Pope Francis has spent a long, long time just now recently talking at Havana to Patriarch of Moscow in secret is not indifferent. And we can expect more. However, I have to be clear that it's not quite so simple for those motives that I've indicated. But there is more to it. It would seem, from what I've picked up, I forget exactly, I think it's maybe through the Sulas, one of these, it's gone around anyway, that the Lord had actually discreetly indicated that actually the historic date for the Easter itself would actually be the Eastern one. We changed the calendar, didn't we? Under Pope Gregory. But anyway, the miracle of Easter happens still on the old day. I mean Holy Saturday in the Holy Sepulchre, when the direct successor of James, who for historic reason has to be the patriarch that was always there, the Greek one, because we imposed the Latin one afterwards for our own people essentially, but historically the line goes on there, the Greek one is the one there for the patriarch of Jerusalem. He goes into the Holy Sepulchre on Holy Saturday, spoliated, and that's the one day in the year when the Holy Light has been extinguished. He goes in, the doors are closed and so on, and from earliest times he encounters there the Lord, and the Holy Fire comes into the Holy Sepulchre, comes from the Holy Sepulchre actually, forms a column of light inside there, and then changes colour, settles down, he's able to light his 2 wads of 33 candles from it, comes out with the burning fire, which is miraculous, doesn't burn the beard, and so on, it's a miraculous fire, and then that goes round the basilica, and they all receive it. and also it goes into certain designated airlines into different patriarchies of the world, including it goes as far as Vienna as well. And so that's indicating that the Lord there has carried on the ancient date, and it's only once every 5 years that it corresponds to ours. So just to be aware, there's more going on than meets the eye. And this particular one is not just new, because it was already there in earlier centuries too. We know that there had been, in the early church itself, a certain division over this. And Irenaeus, true to his name, the peaceful one, had been an element of peace in this. He spoke Celtic, and he was close to the apostles. There had been the apostolic tradition of a certain date. It had come, there were two traditions anyway, and we also in the Celtic West had an ancient tradition of apostolic origin, but it wasn't the same that was coming from Rome. It had to be sorted, and it was for a long time a cause of problem, because when Augustine was sent by Pope Gregory in 596 with 40 monks, he got to Kent in 597, and eventually he had to encounter any Christians who were there. And so these bishops, Celtic bishops, came to meet him. And what was not his surprise when he found that they had a whole weight of tradition, including a different Easter, and at one stage he had to contend with a king and a queen, one following the Roman tradition and the other the Celtic one, and therefore one was celebrating Easter when the other one was just starting the Lenten fast, which was quite serious in those days. And it wasn't sorted until the Synod of Whitby in 662, I believe, and even then it carried on for a century, notably at Iona in Scotland, the Celtic island there, which was very resistant. So all that to say that it had happened before and had to be healed, but it's still there, and it's got to be healed again. But we now, in our time, need to be careful that we are not ourselves imbued with this spirit of independence and presumption with regard to two things: history and geography. We are part of something greater, and if in the East certain things are precious, if in the East certain things take time, if in the East God is so great that he cannot be hurried or pushed about, we perhaps need to calm down and learn from those who have gone before us.